This is a day that the Lord has made, and this is a time for us to rejoice in it. But it's also the day that our Lord chose and the day that we get to spend some special time together and time before Him in worship. And that actually has quite a bit to do with our text and our discussion this evening. I invite you to take out your Bible and open up to the 66th Psalm, or Psalm 66. All the earth. All the earth. Someone asked a bit ago what I was preaching on tonight, and I said, the earth. You can take that a few different ways, but that is the title of tonight's sermon, All the Earth. When we begin to think about God and worshiping God, one of the things we quickly realize as we read through this book, as we survey ancient history throughout, not just ancient history, but you start there and as you move through, one of the things we quickly realize is that as humanity, as people, we are drawn to worship. We always worship someone or something. You might put it this way, that we are made to worship. It is how God designed us. The problem is that we don't always do that in the right way. We either worship the incorrect object, going back to the previous statement of someone or something is worshipped. And as humanity, we've worshipped the stars, we've worshipped animals, all of it usually coming back to worshiping self in some way, making ourselves the God. Or, even in worshiping the right being, the right one, we haven't always conducted that in a way that is pleasing to Him still. But, all of that included, it is true that we are made to worship. This psalm tonight, Psalm 66, is about worship. It extends the call or even gives the command for everyone, and in some ways even everything, to worship God. All the earth is called to worship Him. There is a way in which you could say all of creation worships God. There are places in Scripture, many of those places in the Psalms, where different parts of the world are said to worship God or to give Him praise. Sometimes the trees are called to sing to God, for example. There is a capacity for worship that is with humanity. You might include the angels in that. The ability to use our intellect, our voices, our actions in a way that has more content and is able to then to intentionally, with our desire, our will, give our souls in bowing before the King of the world. Now, slightly switching gears, for we kind of have to. The reason King Hezekiah is up there is because it is at least possible that he is the human author of this psalm. There's not a human author that is directly given to us in Scripture. There's not enough specifics. It's not like David in Psalm 51 or something. It's a bit more general. There's some of the language that lends itself to a time in Hezekiah's life. And so some think it's Hezekiah, some think it's Isaiah. But it's in 2 Kings 18 through 20. It's also in Isaiah 37 and 38. We looked at this not that long ago on a Wednesday evening, in a Wednesday evening devotional. The attacking army there with King Sennacherib, the Assyrian king, and his gigantic army surrounding Jerusalem. Hezekiah and the Jewish people, they don't know what they're going to do. The only thing they know they're going to do is pray and seek God's counsel, seek God's help. Possible that that's the historical setting of this psalm. So if you want to put yourself in that place tonight, then as we read and look at this psalm, get your head in a state of mind of a time when you don't see any options. A time when it feels like whatever it is, I doubt it's an actual army, but whatever it is, you feel like you're surrounded, you're trapped. And then as you read Psalm 66, it's a call to worship. In the midst of that, the calls then. I was reading where when they made the national do not call list, do you remember that? Like in '03, and President George W. Bush, he even talks about it in his, I think it was his inaugural address or something, and it was a really big deal. And they had almost 1 million phone numbers the first day that it was live, the website. People got on there and added their number. We don't like people calling us, interrupting us. But the calls to worship tonight in this psalm are, you might call them an interruption when we get busy with life and we're living in a world surrounded by wonders that point us to God. And we live as people who have an amazing access to His written word. So there's a call interrupting our busyness, our distractedness to worship. Calls are very similar. So I hope not to overemphasize so that the overlap is too much. But there's a call here to come and see in Psalm 66. All right, making sure we're in sync. Come and see. Then the call or the instruction to bless our God or praise our God. And then come and hear. Come and hear. These are two of the major senses that we use in the world to see and hear, and even in the Word as we see the words on the page or as we hear the words read publicly, proclaimed publicly. Or we might even do what some of the Jews were known to do, to read it out loud in our own private devotional time. And then we see it and we hear it. It's also two senses that are easily, like most blessings, most things easily taken for granted. And they're two things that are two of the most common that tend to decrease their ability, their sharpness with age. And so we wear glasses, we wear hearing aids and cochlear implants. Come and see and hear. Let's take a look together. Come and see. We're going to skip the first 4 verses for now and pick up or begin reading together in Psalm 66, verses 5 through 7. These 3 verses is where we find that first call to come and see. See. Come and see. Come and witness the might of God. A God who can speak into nothing and out of nothing an amazing, gigantic, and yet detailed universe just happens by His power. We don't know. We've got some estimates, guesstimates, the vastness of our universe. We've just begun to scope into the depths of space. We might have a slightly better knowledge scientifically on the details, from the little amoeba, and then from there, that one-celled organism onward, and everything in between. One of the features that I've recently noticed, and this may have been that way for a long time, but in the Apple Maps program, you can now zoom out and see the globe. I've done that a few times. It sounds kind of silly, but I've done that and just thought about that planet. Everything that's on that planet. And usually you can still see the little dot that is where you are. on that big globe. Let's read these 3 verses together now. Come and see. He says, come and see what God has done. He is awesome in his deeds. Your English text may have, he is terrible. Anybody have that? Terrible. It's the word that we also translate, I think this might be helpful, hopefully it is. It's the word we also translate as fear or awe. Like the fear of the Lord. And so sometimes it is more negative. It is, you need to be afraid and tremble and you're shaking your boots. Sometimes it is more, you need to be very aware, very serious about this. This is God. As we said this morning, he's your father, you're his child, assuming that's the case, but he's still your God. And here it's that what he's done is something that ought to cause us to do that, to wake up. So the invite is come and see, and what you see is awesome. It's terrible in the sense that it is so powerful. It's like when you go and you tour a nuclear plant. I mean, that's just a small, trivial example compared to power, the deeds of God. But this is amazing. This is incredible. It's intriguing. I want to see, but maybe some of it I don't know that I really want to see. I've seen too much. Just come and see the deeds of God. Verse 6, or the rest of verse 5, toward the children of man. What he's done for us. In this context, there is the individual, there is the communal side. There are times when the writer is speaking to Israel, it seems, and at other times it is everybody. It's all the earth. He isn't just Israel's God. Come and see that. So what he's done in verse 6, this might be more Israel. He turned the sea into dry land. They passed through the river on foot. Sound familiar? Sounds quite a bit like the Red Sea crossing, doesn't it? Could also be crossing the Jordan when they entered the Promised Land. More than one possibility. Those are a couple big ones. They did, verse 6 also says, rejoice in him. Or there, we, rather. If I can get my grammar, I need to come and see the text here. There did we rejoice in him. There. It's a memory attachment point. The writer's having us think back with him to this point in time when God did something, historical actions from God, when God showed himself in a very direct way. We see him in his wonders every day, but there are moments in history you can go back to and attach your memory to, whether you were there or not. Think of how they rejoiced. We can rejoice in him. And as you see on the screen there, you can look at this poetry here. There's the positive side, rejoicing in God, in his awesome deeds, here in his deliverance. Think about those children of Israel marching through the Red Sea with the Egyptian army on their heels, or marching through the Jordan with some pretty scary things on the other side, and really on both sides, but for sure on the other side, the giants in Canaan. And in the middle parallel, in verse 6 and 7, he says, he who rules by his might forever, or his reign in power. He's the good, sovereign ruler of everything, all the earth, whose eyes keep watch. Come and see what God has done. God uses his eyes to watch over. We have traditionally called this his omniscience. That big way of saying God watches over everything. His omnipresence is included here, I think, as well. In his reign, his sight, he is everywhere. It's the middle part here, the middle parallel. It's his reign and his watch. And then the negative at the end of verse 7, keep it in mind, the positive is we can rejoice in him if we're the one he's delivering. But then verse 7, you got to like verse 7. Let not the rebellious exalt themselves The NET or Net Bible translates this as rebels, do not exalt yourselves. And I'm not a big Star Wars guy. Like I will admit, I'll make another confession. Today's preacher confession day. This is a really bad one, okay, so don't excommunicate me for this. I had never seen any of the movies at all until after we were married. Okay, so that tells you how big of a Star Wars fan I am. But whenever I read verse 7, part of where my mind went was this almost sounds like, out of context, it almost sounds like a Darth Vader quote. It's like, be not rebellious, or don't rebel and exalt yourselves, you rebels. All right? That's kind of how it sounded in my ears, okay? But here, it is those who rebel against God's sovereignty. And it's a warning then to the rebels, be careful. But it is an odd thought that it's not, don't be rebellious. I mean, that's part of it, but here it's more, you're already rebellious, be careful. Don't exalt yourself. If you're rebellious, then the opposite, if you made it a positive, would be, it's time for some humility. You've seen what he's done for his people, and part of that includes punishing those who are rebellious, like Pharaoh and his army who died in that sea. Come and see what God has done for his people. Then I think forward to John chapter 1. In verse 39 and 46 of John 1. First one is when two disciples that are there, they're making that transition from following John to following Jesus. And they ask him in John 1:39, where are you staying? We want to stay with you for a bit. And Jesus doesn't tell them. Jesus is a master at these kind of conversations to bring curiosity and lead people in a certain direction. And so here he just says the words from Psalm 66, verse 5, come and see. Then a bit later, when Philip goes to Nathanael, somebody found Philip. Now Philip goes to Nathanael. And Nathanael makes that old question, Nazareth? Anything good? And what does he say? Come and see. It's an invitation in Psalm 66 and in John 1 from Jesus, our God, to come and see me. Then it becomes our invitation as his disciples, as his worshipers, to others. Come and see. How much of that is a part of my demeanor as a Christian? Or is it that I'm too caught up in what I need to do today? I'm not saying that you have to use this exact language, but then again, people have, and it has been successful after this. Want to know what God's about? You want to know what it means to be a Christian? Come check it out. Come and see. And as you keep reading John 1, there's more about sight in that chapter. That might be something for you to look at a little closer for some homework maybe, but Jesus talks about seeing. He says, I saw you under the tree, Nathanael. And then he tells Nathanael, you will see something incredible. You're going to see more. Come and see. This is just the beginning. Psalm 66 invites us to use our eyes, either our mental eyes to think back to what God has done, or our eyes in his word, or our eyes now to behold the beauties of his world, or of his people. No, we're not always so beautiful. I don't mean that physically, okay, before you start thinking the wrong thing. Because we're people. And God's people can hurt us more than anybody. But I promise you, you keep your eyes open, you come and see, and you'll see what God has done, and you'll see what God is doing in his people. Let's go back to Psalm 66. Pick up in our reading in verse 8. Bless our God. Bless our God. It is that turn of phrase we see throughout the Scriptures. We see it most in the Psalms and in the letters. Peter uses it. Paul uses it. It's not the way we normally use bless or blessed. We think God blesses us. We might be a blessing to someone else. We have blessings that we give to others. But here the word is used as we return to God in praise, in worship. And so verse 8 says, "Bless our God, O peoples. Let the sound of his praise be heard." And then he tells us who this is. "Come and see, come and hear, who has kept our soul among the living and has not let our feet slip. For you, O God, have tested us. You have tried us as silver is tried." This is why I use those two words, testing, rescue. Who doesn't want to be rescued? Who wants to be rescued when it feels like you're in the blacksmith shop, or in this case, the silversmith shop? Last month, when we went to Williamsburg, Virginia, one of the highlights for me was going to the gunsmith, his outdoor shop. It's the only place in the world where they make muskets in the exact same way, without any modern processes at all, just as they did in the 1600s. And seeing what they start with and how they melt and temper and refine by fire. Fire has that power to refine the impurities, to temper and strengthen what is weak. That's what he says here. "You've tested us as silver is tried. You brought us into the net." If this is Hezekiah, this is the net that Sennacherib was said to put around Jerusalem. "You laid a crushing burden on our backs." It's when you get up in the morning and it feels like you're wearing a backpack, but you're not necessarily. You've got this big pack of burdens on you. Now, he wants us to give them to him. He may allow us to be burdened, to be tested. Do we like it when God puts us to the test? What is the quote in Genesis 22? God tested Abraham. Then he continues, "You let men," verse 12, "ride over our heads." There are some ancient depictions of the victors riding their horses literally over the heads of their defeated enemies. That's what you did. "We went through fire and through water, through flame and flood. You brought us out to a place of abundance." So back in verses 8 and 9, "You delivered us. You brought us through. You saved us from death itself. For them, an angel killed 186,000 of Sennacherib's soldiers." I'm not saying that kind of event is going to happen in our lives. But I'm also not saying that God won't do the impossible. But it may not be fun in the meantime, before you get to that point. There's a pretty long extent between verse 9 and verse 12 that's testing and flame and burden. Then he brings us out into the wide open spaces. We know about wide open spaces in Oklahoma. We got a few mountains. We got a lot of open space. And it's a picture then of freedom, of contentment. Everything had crammed us in. We were caught in a net. We were put in the refiner's block. And then you brought us out to safety. So, there's this faithful response. Let's read verses 13 through 15. Note with me the way he says, "I will," 4 times. He says it again in verse 16, "now to others," and we'll get there shortly. In verses 13 through 15, he says this, "I will come into your house with burnt offerings. I will perform my vows to you, that which my lips uttered and my mouth promised when I was in trouble." And I don't know here if this is Hezekiah with Sennacherib on his tail, or if this is Hezekiah in the next chapter of Isaiah, Isaiah 38, when Hezekiah is dying. And he appeals to God, and in a way, he says, God, you know me, you know what I've been like, and the implication is, if you give me another few more years, he gets 15, I'm going to keep serving you. Have you ever done that? It's a dangerous thing to make promises to a God like ours. You ever said, God, if you'll do this, and I'm not saying it's wrong to do that. Hezekiah does that. But you better be careful, right? If you'll do this, then I'll do that. Or some parents that have prayed, let me live and have the health to take care of my children until they graduate or until they're able to be on their own. And I know some that have prayed prayers like that. Hezekiah says, I'm going to keep my promise. He wasn't trying to bribe God, but he did make an appeal to God for help. And now he responds faithfully. He says, my mouth promised when I was in trouble, I will offer to you burnt offerings of fatted animals with the smoke of the sacrifice of rams. We would say something like, I will worship you in the way that you have prescribed in your word for our covenants. I will make an offering of bulls and goats. The call in verses 8 through 15 now is to use our hearts, our words, our promises, our commitment to bless God. We're called to be a blessing in our world, our environment. Do we ever think about blessing, praising God? I don't know if praise comes naturally in our world. Praising God. There's almost a disconnect, isn't there? Between our world, the real world, and then there's God off in heaven. Sometimes that's difficult for us. And we could talk about things that have happened, the Renaissance and thinking and philosophy that may even is still affecting us somewhat today, and modernism and postmodernism. But if we're going to be the people of God, we are to spend time simply saying, you are great. You've done this for me. I'm going to be faithful in response. And then verses 16 through 20 will close us out this evening. Come and hear. Come hear what God has done. There's something there about inviting people, telling people, sharing with them what God has done for me. How He's changed my life in Jesus, the blessings He's given to me. And when you think about seeing and hearing in these verses, I almost wonder if part of it is because of the way those senses work. That we take in so much visual information, whether you're a visual learner or not, or you're auditory, think of that too here. And it might be that you see something from a distance as your eyes scan, assuming you're not on your phone. And then you see something that catches your eye. Maybe something is happening, some commotion. Maybe it's something beautiful you want to get a closer look at, and so you get closer. And here it's you see what God has done, you come closer, and then it's more personal. Come and hear now what God has done for me. In verses 16 through 18. Hearing is something else that we take for granted. Seeing the face, the ones that love you and you love. And there's something terrifying about losing that. Hearing the voice of those that love you. There's something about memory. We have visual memories, we have auditory memories, and you can still hear maybe your mother's voice. You can still hear certain things that were said to you that impacted your memory banks in a special way. I think about a preacher who began to lose his hearing, and he was standing behind the lectern, the podium one Sunday, and he calls on someone to lead a prayer. And they just stand up where they are, as it sometimes is done, and lead a prayer right there. Well, he, as was his habit, he knelt down during the prayer behind the podium. Problem, I think at least somebody is catching on. He couldn't hear the prayer. There's no mic. He can't hear. You see the problem? When do you stand back up? And so the people sitting in the pew, they all of a sudden start seeing their preacher doing this kind of thing. He starts peeking out around the side of it. He doesn't just stand back up and look. He just kind of pokes his head out to the side to see if the guy had sat down, I guess, or if his lips were still moving, that kind of thing. There's some comedy to those moments too. You have to laugh sometimes to keep from crying, right? Let's read these verses. Come, hear. Come and hear, all who fear God. So come and see what God has done for his people. Come, bless his name, O peoples, O nations. Now it's if you fear God. You've come, you've seen, you've heard. Come and hear, and I will tell you what he has done for my soul. I cried to him with my mouth, and high praise was on my tongue. If I had cherished iniquity in my heart, it's harboring, holding on to sins, cherishing them on the one hand, aiming for them in another. That's another connotation of this word here. It's the direction of my heart, or it is what I hold dear in my heart. He says, if I had done that with sin, then, he says, he would not have listened. But, verse 19, truly, God has listened. He has attended to the voice of my prayer. He's listened to me. And then the crescendo of this psalm. It may even be broken up a bit in your text. Translators think maybe this is the bottom line. Verse 20. Blessed be. So, bless our God. Praise him. Now, praised be, blessed be God. Because he has not rejected my prayer or removed his steadfast love from me. There's sin in prayer here. It's possible to pray while holding on to our pet sin. It's possible, and that may even be part of what's involved here, it is possible to pray sinful prayers. Even in that it's possible to ask and be selfish in our prayers. Now, in Isaiah 38, 2 and 3, Hezekiah, part of what he told God there was, I have followed you with my whole heart. There are no chambers of my heart that don't belong to you. I'm not holding out. There's not a closet here, dark closet, where I've got this sin kept. Or there's the warnings in James 4. Your prayers aren't being answered. God's not hearing your prayer because you're just trying to spend on your extravagances. And your worldliness is keeping your prayers from being right before God. I think about that song that came out a few years back. I don't even really know the words. I didn't look them up to quote them tonight, but some of you may have heard it. It's taken slightly on Jesus about blessing and praying for your enemies. And then there's this, okay, I've got an enemy. I think it's probably a breakup love song. And the chorus is this list of, I pray this happens to you. I pray that this falls on your head. And I pray that all these misfortunes happen to you. I'm going to pray for you. And it's a funny song. But it might be something we could be guilty of. Why do I want this to happen? Why do I ask God for this? If I'm asking God for a new job or a promotion or why? There might be a legitimate place to pray those kind of prayers. But why? And then look at this one. Look at Isaiah chapter 37. Come and see, come and hear. And then we go back to this time when Hezekiah is in trouble. And in Isaiah 37, verse 17, God is called. This psalm, we said, is about calls on our hearts, our souls, to worship, to be faithful to God. Come and see. Isaiah 37, verse 17. It's part of the prayer that Hezekiah prays on behalf of the people and himself. And it says, incline your ear, O Lord, and hear. Open your eyes, O Lord, and see. It's in reverse order in Psalm 66. Hear all the words of Sennacherib, which he has sent to mock the living God. Hezekiah said to God, look, he listened. Not that God didn't already know. But that's how we sometimes feel, isn't it? Like, do you see? Do you hear what they're saying? Do you hear my problems? And then a psalm is written, a song is written for his people to come and see who he is. That he is the living God. Worship. Let me tell you about my God. Someone wrote it this way. It's someone I don't often agree with. But he says, worship is when you're aware of what you've been given is far greater than what you can give. Worship is the awareness that if it were not for his touch, you'd still be hobbling and hurting, bitter and broken. Worship is the half-glazed expression on the parched face of a desert pilgrim as he discovers that the oasis is not a mirage. Worship is the thank you that refuses to be silenced. Come and hear. Shema. That Hebrew word in Deuteronomy, come, hear, O Israel. It's used here to say, you come and you hear about God. I'd like you to do something for me. All right? This isn't quite the invitation song. Almost. Would you stand up as we read this last passage together? And that way you won't have to stand and sing. I'll try to just say sing or something, all right? Let's go back to the very beginning. Do you remember what we did? We skipped the first 4 verses of Psalm 66. Psalm 66, 1 through 4. Let's read this together. And I encourage you to take a look at Romans chapter 13, or Romans chapter 15, verses 8 through 13, where Paul takes some of this all earth and all peoples and says that's what Jesus came to do. Part of it began here. Let's read this together, and then the psalm will be yours. Psalm 66, 1 through 4. Shout for joy to God, all the earth. Sing the glory of his name. Give to him glorious praise. Say to God, how awesome are your deeds. So great is your power that your enemies come cringing to you. All the earth worships you and sings praise is to you. They sing praises to your name. Let's sing together.